How do you make a farm or ranch more sustainable? There's no single answer, but there are common practices used by producers across the country to improve profitability, quality of life, and environmental stewardship. In this episode, we'll take a look at cover crops and soil health. Farmers everywhere are learning the importance of improving the health of their soil. Planting a cover crop is one of the best ways to get there. Including cover crops in our crop rotations helps us build soil structure and fertility, protect water quality, suppress pests, and improve the bottom line. The benefits are more pronounced when we use cover crops and reduced tillage together. We can manage soil nutrients more efficiently by using the right cover crops. For example, plant legume cover crops before heavy feeder crops to supply them with nitrogen. After harvest, follow with a grass cover crop to scavenge excess nutrients and reduce leaching into waterways. Living cover crop roots hold the soil together to slow erosion and even help break up compacted soils. Cover crop residues add organic matter to soil, improving water holding capacity, water infiltration, and aeration. Soils high in organic matter can better retain moisture during hot, dry years and absorb excess rain in wetter years. These soils also have abundant microorganisms that cycle nutrients and suppress disease. Cover crops also help manage pests, including herbicide-resistant weeds. Leaving a mat of cover crop residue smothers weeds, cutting herbicide costs. Cover crops can pay for themselves within the first few years by cutting input costs and providing modest yield boosts. Their value increases when grown for seed or as forage for livestock. Over the long term, they help us build resilient cropping systems. There's much more to learn about cover crops. Start exploring today.
All right, so I just want to welcome you all and thank you for joining us this afternoon and taking this time out of your lunch hour to learn a little bit more about cover crops. We thought that video was just kind of a nice overview to start with of kind of what cover crops are and kind of pick up from where we left off last week where Rob talked to us about cover crop seeding and termination. This week, we're going to switch over to talking about cover crops and how they can impact wildlife, birds, and pollinators. Before I get into that, I do want to bring to your attention that these modules that we are using for these presentations are part of a larger set of training modules. So there's 11 of them, and they're actually available for anyone who wants to use them, whether that's kind of for your own education or if you need some content for a presentation to someone else. They're available on our website, and there are speaker notes within the PowerPoints and things like that. So we will jump right into cover crop impacts on wildlife, birds, and pollinators. So cover crops overall can impact a really wide range of wildlife, whether that's mammals to birds to reptiles, pollinators and other invertebrates or insects. And broadly, they do this by expanding the portion of the year that there's plant cover, habitat, and food. And that expansion could be twice as long as the time when your normal cash crops are growing in a traditional, corn, soybean type system. And kind of when it comes to crop fields, we're used to considering maybe what we see above ground, like how the plants look. And when talking about wildlife, we may kind of feel like we should start talking the same way, focusing on those above ground creatures. But the main impact of cover crops really does start in the soil. Cover crops are first and foremost a soil health tool, and soil health refers not just to physical and chemical properties, but also that biological component of the soils that's really important. So when we think about our underground biology, there really is just this entire diverse world that exists in the soil. In a single cubic meter of soil, there can be over 1,000 different species of invertebrates. And so that just goes to show that there is just so much going on there that we sometimes don't think about. Earthworms, though, are one that we kind of really tend to know is important. Earthworms are really big for infiltration, building soil structure and soil health. They help add nutrients to the soil, and cover crops can have a really measurable impact on your earthworm population by providing food and protection for earthworms. And then in turn, those earthworms become food for larger animals like birds and becoming, kind of that base of the ecosystem. So the food source component is really key for kind of talking about our invertebrates. And as far as invertebrates and even microorganisms and everything, you've maybe heard the saying before that a single acre of soil is like having two elephants in the ground. And that just represents how much food needs to be available to maintain all that life that's in the soil. So if you think about the difference between a barren field and a tilled field, in comparison to one with lots of organic matter, living roots, and green cover, there's really no comparison in what that provides for kind of all levels of life. So your invertebrates, and that can be, your insects, spiders, mites, earthworms, you name it. Those are really key part of the food chain. When we talk about insects in agriculture, we kind of tend to think about the ones that we don't like, pests that cause crop damage. But the truth is that crop pests make up only a small portion of the invertebrate community. Most insects are either beneficial or really have no impact on cash crops. And particularly important is our beneficial insects and natural enemies. So the beneficials are the ones that provide some sort of benefit to us, either pollination or nutrient cycling in the soil, or those predatory natural enemies of the pests that we really don't want overtaking the crops. So it's really important to consider those as part of the larger picture, especially when spraying insecticides or insecticidal seed treatments. Because these not only kill the target pests, but they can also damage those beneficial pest populations that can actually be a really huge benefit for you. Broadly, those invertebrates are really important, again, as that base of the entire food chain. It's what those larger animals feed on. And if you want to build, a healthy ecosystem, you really need that good, strong base. When it comes to thinking about species selection for invertebrates, we always kind of think about more diverse being the ideal option. Anytime you can add something that flowers, like a legume or a brassica, that will really help out your pollinators. But truthfully, any kind of living cover you put out there will help support those beneficial insects much more than just that field of bare soil or even a field of crop residue if you no-till. And that habitat is also, an important reproductive habitat. So a place for insects to lay eggs and that sort of thing. This is a really good, again, visual representation, probably something we're very familiar with seeing, just those barren fields that, they're really not providing very much of value for your wildlife, whether big or small. But that green in the below cover crop fields, that makes a really huge difference in providing habitat and food that can sustain important species. Sometimes we talk about this as a term called bridging the gap, where instead of there being this barren period between your crops, there's always something living and growing and contributing to sustaining that ecosystem versus when you just have corn and beans by themselves. And also there's a really great potential to change the way that the landscape looks. There are over 250 million acres in row crop agriculture. And if you can just imagine how great of an impact there could be from shifting all of that to a system that more even just mimics the design that nature wants to take itself. So kind of switching onto our larger wildlife that builds off of our invertebrates, let's talk about bird populations, especially in the winter. So mixes are really wonderful for birds as well, but even just a simple single species cover crop of rye or even oats can provide that benefit of food and protective cover. Additionally, your migratory bird populations, especially if you happen to farm near river bottoms or anything like that. There was a University of Illinois study that was done that showed that birds frequented cover cropped fields much more than fallow fields in the winter, and many of these were migrating birds. And although some of that benefit does come from having that extra food source, they may actually prefer these cover crop fields just because of that extra physical cover it provides for them in the winter when you may not have that in a lot of other areas. And of course, thinking about the spring, as you can imagine, spring is a really important time. When in a traditional corn and soy system, you probably wouldn't have a lot of cover. Oftentimes you think of birds as those first sign of spring. You see bird activity here, birds chirping, and having those cover crops in the spring can offer nesting habitat and predator protection. And that's really critical for species like meadowlark, for example, that don't really have the expanses of grassland as there used to be in certain areas. Also, those insects that are thriving, the populations that thrive more due to cover crops, those are really important for the spring diets of birds. And quail, for example, especially benefits both from that cover that's provided by cover crops, as well as the increase in insects that are available. Grassland birds have the greatest benefit in the summer, and whether that is from, a summer cover crop that's planted after wheat, for example, or maybe you have created some additional habitat in your waterways or field edges or ditches. But that additional cover provides, brood rearing habitat, and also just maintains that healthy insect population that's really important for those small chicks. And your healthy soil and your healthy habitat helps with all these things. So what about mammals? Oftentimes people will plant dedicated food plots to attract deer, for example, and oftentimes these food plot mixes contain similar plant species as you might find in a cover crop mix. And that has really great potential to attract wildlife across every acre. And so basically everything can become some sort of food plot, especially in the winter. And that can be really great for the interest of hunters. Deer will really graze on any sort of grass cover crop, but they particularly do like the legumes like Austrian winter peas and clovers. And then these things also are kind of attractive to voles, rabbits, and fur bearers. And so these are some photos from a game camera that was set up in a cover crop field in Centralia. And a lot of these smaller mammals will forage in cover crops at night. So it's a raccoon, a rabbit, and I think a possum on the bottom. As we move into spring and summer, cover crops, whether those are overwintering or early planted or summer planted, that can provide that fawning and bedding habitat for deer. And again, voles and rabbits kind of can think that it could be possible for those to reach damaging populations. And so if that is a concern, we do have a separate training module as one of these 11 training modules, and that goes into detail on cover crop impacts on pest populations, particularly kind of focusing on vole and slug issues. And so that is available on the website if kind of interested in that part of it. There's not been a whole lot of research that's been done on the impacts of cover crops on things like frogs and toads and other reptiles, but it's probably pretty easy to understand that living plants and physical cover will provide a better habitat than a bare tilled field. Soil disturbance from tillage also, you can imagine, would be very likely to negatively impact these populations. So kind of like we touched on a couple slides ago, as we talk about wildlife and mammals and encouraging these populations, it can be really easy to wonder how easily these could become a pest problem. But another thing to keep in mind is, nature kind of seeks an equilibrium. It has its own way of balancing itself, and kind of just says that, sort of build it and they will come principle applies to your insects and small mammals. That also applies to the predators that hunt them. So a healthy raptor population can really kind of help keep those concerns like vole populations and other things from getting out of control. But the thing is, they do need places to perch. So you can either try to leave trees where you can, maybe along a fence line or things like that. Or sometimes people even put out perches exactly for this purpose, just to really make sure that you do have that additional layer of the food chain and cycle that can keep some of these things in check. Similarly, your coyotes and foxes, those will benefit from the cover and the prey populations. And anecdotally, sometimes people do start seeing things like foxes, for example, that they don't, you're not used to seeing as much anymore. So kind of moving on to talk more about management. So what can you plant? Here in the photo, we have an example of a diverse mix, multiple species. Ideally, you have them blooming at different times if they're a flowering species. So this is a crimson clover and a vetch, and that helps support beneficial insects, particularly pollinators and beneficials. Keep in mind, the greatest benefit to wildlife comes from letting the cover crops grow as long as possible. Accumulating biomass, allowing time to flower, and that provides habitat for animals and insects that are then, of course, needed for your nesting bird diets and farther down the food chain in that manner. Then ideally, cover crops are not a one-off thing. You hopefully combine those with other things to create a larger system. And no-till is one that works very well in companion with cover crops. It might be sometimes tempting to want to terminate with tillage if you're maybe new to cover crops, but from a wildlife perspective, it can be really damaging to those populations that you just work to try and build up. So this list here kind of shows how your no-till can benefit each of these different types of wildlife that we talked about. Your invertebrates, by having no-till, you're protecting them from being damaged by fall tillage and allowing them to overwinter and retain your beneficial insects into your cash crop. Bird nests, is one thing that there's a little bit of an unavoidable damage that comes because you do have to plant, the thing that you're trying to grow. The difference between no-till planting and tillage, though, is that you might be able to retain some of your bird nests rather than just wiping them totally out. Similarly, your reptiles, amphibians, mammals, by no-tilling, it protects them from being killed by tillage, which then in turn is beneficial for those predators because they retain their prey base. And then to go even further, I touched on this a little bit earlier, but if you try to identify other areas that can provide wildlife benefit, like whether that be contour strips, field edges, tree lines, or ditches, that not only adds to your overall biodiversity, but that contributes to some other large picture things like erosion control, reduce fertilizer and chemical runoff, and even allow for more grazing if you happen to be grazing your cover crops. So the reduction of erosion and minimizing soil sediment into ponds, streams, and rivers, that's further beneficial to your wildlife, such as even your fish, by reducing those impacts on the environments even beyond just the field level. So some ideas for this could be, adding in wildflower strips, planting native species to buffer strips and field edges and so on. And there are a lot of funding options that exist for some of these additional options. And for example, it could be under the CSP, the Conservation Stewardship Program, have funding for pollinator habitats and so on. Overall, cover crops just add to a diversified farm landscape. Really large scale, they can help with those things like carbon sequestration, rainfall infiltration, water retention and drought, and other things to kind of mitigate some of those weather extremes that we seem to be increasingly familiar with. And it's also a way that farmers can improve relations with landowners, maybe not only those who like to hunt, but any landowners that value conservation or even just seeing green landscape instead of barren fields. All of these pieces just contribute to building up and restoring that larger system and natural cycle that has a lot of benefits to all parties involved. So just, again, really think large scale. Just everything does have an impact, kind of like that ripple effect where, your smaller changes impact the next thing and then the next thing. And so you want to make sure that your change is a positive one. So if you kind of are interested in this topic and want to learn more, we have put together a document of some additional resources, a few SARE publications and other things. And Kelly is going to share those with you to your emails, and whatever email you registered for this event for, we'll share those out. And I also want to remind you of the upcoming webinars. We have 2 more in the month of July. Next week, we will talk about strategies for cash crop planting following a cover crop. And then the week after that, we'll talk about grazing cover crops. And these webinars start at 12:15, same Zoom link as today. And so with that, I would like to open it up for discussion, whether you want to share an experience you've had or if you have a question.
Thanks, Bethany. Yeah, does anybody have any questions? You can also post them in the chat.